What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen, and I'm back with another true crime video. And today, we're going to be talking about the suspicious death of 21-year-old Elizabeth, also known as Libby Caswell. And honestly, this case is so wildly devastating. There are a lot of really hard topics I'm going to be speaking about in this case. It's also going to be a very long video, so make sure you're in the proper mindset before going into this. But it is incredibly important that this case continues to be pushed out there. There are elements of Libby's case that bring me right back to cases like Christian Andriacchio, cases that are just burned into my brain because they've involved families who have never stopped pushing for answers when they felt from the very beginning that something was not right. And it seems the police department seemed to just go with one direction and one direction only. And this one hits a little harder for me because I think it was my second, possibly third crime con back in New Orleans. I was a part of the PI experience where myself and John Lorden helped walk everybody through Christian Andriacchio's case. His family provided all of the case files. We did videos beforehand. We held like a whole panel at CrimeCon. And seeing the amount of crowdsourcing and how much that helped was huge for Christian's family. And the first time I heard of Libby's case was a few years after that, I think in 2020. It might have actually been the year immediately after. I have no idea. All the years blur together. Because her family had a whole panel about her case at CrimeCon in, I think it was in Dallas. I didn't go to that when I was there virtually. I just knew I had to tell her story. Now, officially, Libby's cause of death was listed as asphyxia, but her manner of death was ruled undetermined. And even now, all these years later, her family is still fighting because they believe what happened to Libby was never fully dealt with the way that it should have been. So before we get into the investigation, all the missteps, the horror of what happened in the time leading up to Libby's death, I want to obviously start with Libby herself. Now, Elizabeth Alexandra Caswell was born on March 25th, 1996 in Independence, Missouri, to Robert and Cynthia Caswell. And from what everyone has said, Libby had this boundless energy from the time she was little. And it was actually one of the main reasons she was put into dance and cheer as a little girl. She loved being active, she loved performing, she loved being around people, and she really was excelling in both of those things. And she stayed involved in dance and cheer through a huge part of her childhood. She actually made varsity cheerleading at William Chrisman High School, where she attended. And I think in her freshman year, the team was actually invited to perform at Disney, which was a really big deal. And it wasn't cheap, but her family, wanted to see Libby chase her dreams. So they worked hard to get her there, and she had a great time. She also competed in gymnastics too, and she took first place at Grand Nationals twice. So all of this wasn't just some hobby for Libby. It was a huge part of her world. This was something that she dedicated every moment to. And it fits the way that people have described her. She was vibrant, social, excited. She had a whole lot of drive and a whole lot of life in her. Libby was also described as being incredibly friendly and encouraging. She was very easy to be around, someone that people were comfortable around very quickly, and she left a real impression on the people who knew her. But it seems that Libby was most known for being incredibly positive and optimistic, especially when it came to people. Libby could see the good in everyone. Honestly, even when maybe she shouldn't have. She didn't really hold grudges. She wanted to believe the best about the people that she loved. And her friends said that this was one of her best qualities, but maybe also one of the things that hurt her the most in the end. Now, aside from that, Libby also had dreams for herself. According to her family, Libby had hopes of modeling. It was something that she dabbled in a little bit when she was in high school, which really makes sense when you picture someone who loved performance and loved expression and seems to have that kind of confidence and spark about her. And then there was her family. And one detail that really stands out is just how close she was with her little sister. They were best friends, not just sisters, but like genuinely best friends. They spent all of their time together. Libby was important to so many people. She was a daughter, she was a sister, she was a friend, and later on, she also became a mom. And that, more than anything, seems to have become the center of her life. Even once her life became a lot more complicated, and once there were problems and instability and things that people around her were worried about, which we will be getting into, the love that she had for her son is probably one of the clearest and most consistent things in this entire case. So with that being said, let's get into the day that changed everyone's world forever. On Monday, December 11th, 2017, at around 8 p.m., a 911 call came in from the Sports Stadium Motel in Independence, Missouri. And the caller on the other end of the line was frantic, and he told the dispatcher that his girlfriend had hanged herself in the bathroom with his belt.
My grandma just in the bathroom with my pill. My dad woke up and I don't know what to do right now.
Do you tell us you breathing at all?
Oh man, I was asleep and then I had woke up and found her like I don't know how long it did that.
He claimed that he had been asleep, that he woke up, looked around for her, and found her that way, and he had no idea what to do. And the dispatcher asked this caller, is she breathing? Have you checked for a pulse? Just trying to get a better sense of what was happening. But he said, no, like she's pale, she's blue. I don't think that she's breathing. But the caller at this point said he had already left the motel room. He locked himself out and couldn't get back in. And then all of a sudden, very abruptly, the call ended. So when the first officers got to room 319 at this motel, they were walking into what should have still been an active emergency, and they only had a little bit of information that the caller managed to relay before the call ended, because from their perspective, they have this hysterical man on the other end of the line who was saying he had just found his girlfriend unresponsive, he's locked himself out of the room. They expected him to still be there when they arrived, standing outside the door, trying to flag someone down, maybe trying to break the door down. I mean, who knows? At least waiting on police doing something. But instead, when they arrived, he was nowhere to be found. Like everything at this motel was quiet and the room was still locked. Now, officers initially tried to get one of the motel employees to open it, but I don't know if there was just no one with access, that had the master key to get in, or if maybe there wasn't even anyone up at the front. So eventually, they just had to force their way in. And before they even got into the bathroom, the room itself seems to have raised questions. All of the lights were off. The television was on, which that in and of itself is not strange. But the room was in a state of total disarray. Like, it looked like someone had been living in this room, at least in my opinion from seeing photos, for an extended period of time, or that there had been some sort of scuffle or incident or something that just left everything trashed. There were clothes all over the floor, belongings were scattered around, drawers were pulled out, there were empty bottles of liquor. There was also a broken men's watch band on the bed, a purse was spilled out, and there was also what appeared to be a diamond ring on the floor. And in the What Happened in Nashville podcast, which I highly, highly recommend if you want to hear every single itty bitty detail about this case, they said that there was also a printed photo of a man's face in one of the open drawers, just really random. And then the officers got to the bathroom. Now, the bathroom door was closed, and some accounts say that the light was off in there as well, which again was just a little bit odd because, the caller had claimed to have walked into and seen that she was blue and pale, but we're talking 8 p.m. in the winter with all the other lights in the motel room off, so how could you see anything? But regardless, when they opened the door, in the small space between the toilet and the bathtub, they found a young woman on the floor with a camouflage canvas belt loosely around her neck. She was wearing sweatpants and a pink sweatshirt, and immediately to authorities, the body position seemed odd. Now, from the photos that are available, I tried my hardest to find some sort of official listing online. It seems that this motel either has already shut down or is about to shut down. And the few places I found where you could go to book it, there were no official photos. So I was relying on photos that other people have taken. Now, I have no idea if this is what the bathrooms looked like in every single room, but the one bathroom that I saw, which looks similar to the photos taken at the scene, you open the bathroom door on the wall directly in front of you, the toilet, and then along the whole right side of the wall is the bathtub. So Libby's head was basically wedged over on the far side of the bathroom, far away from the door, with her feet angled back toward the door. And this was important because the caller had said when he opened the door, his girlfriend had fallen, which would indicate that she likely had hanged herself from the doorway. So how on earth did her head get all the way wedged on the opposite side of the bathroom between the toilet and the bathtub? But one of the other things noted by police was the way that her feet were propped up against the wall, almost like they had been placed there so the bathroom door could open and close. Regardless, the position that she was in at this point would not be a natural way to fall. Now, could she have been moved? Was this man in there trying to help her and then just set her down before he walked out? Those were all questions they had to answer. But regardless, it was a strange situation to walk into. They also noted that she was cold to the touch, which suggested that she had been dead for some time, and also raised the question of why did it take so long for this caller to reach out? Like, clearly, he hadn't caught this immediately after it happened. This woman had been dead for some time. Officers at this point had also gone to the motel office and confirmed that room 319 had been rented under Libby's name, which is how they identified the young woman they had just found in the bathroom as 21-year-old Libby Caswell. So at that point, what officers are seeing in the room is really not fully lining up with the self-inflicted hanging that had just been described on the 911 call. At the very least, there were a few things that needed a little bit more explaining. But even then, authorities seemed to note that they believed this was a potential homicide. And in those first few hours, that's exactly how this was treated, a potential homicide scene. But by the time officers showed up at Libby's parents' house a few hours later that night, the way it was being framed at that point was already starting to shift. At this point, they broke the news to her parents that Libby was dead and it was self-inflicted. Now, right away, her parents were confused because they had never heard Libby talk about hurting herself. So when officers started asking, had she ever threatened self-harm and all these other questions, their immediate answer was no, absolutely not. Like, she has a son, she's been working hard for him, which again, I will get into all of that in a little bit. Like, this would not be something that she would ever do. But then Libby's mom's mind went straight to one specific question. Where is Devin? Now, around the same time that Libby's family was hearing the news about what happened, police ended up finding the person who made that 911 call originally. It was Devin, who was also Libby's on-again, off-again boyfriend and the father of her son. Now, hours after that original call, when they were at this motel trying to piece things together, they didn't know where he was at, why he had left, he finally contacted authorities and said that he was ready to talk. And so he went to the police station. And the version of events that he gave police became the first real narrative of what supposedly happened in room 319 leading up to Libby's death. Now, according to Devin, he and Libby and a friend named Nick had checked into the motel very early that morning, and they all had been using Libby's Ford Fusion to drive around. In his version of events, they got to the motel at around 6:30 that morning. However, the motel paperwork has been reported as showing 7:10 a.m., so obviously not a huge discrepancy, but I feel every detail matters, so I put it out there. He said that they all were hanging out for a while, and Nick ended up leaving the motel at around 9 a.m., so at that point, it was just Libby and Devin. Devin continued to tell police that he and Libby had been up all night the night before, so once Nick left, he said that he first went to take a shower. After he got out, Libby went to take a shower, and sometime around 10 or 11, I'm assuming when Libby was still showering or something, he fell asleep on the bed. And according to him, he stayed asleep for basically the rest of the day. He told authorities that he woke up at around 8 that evening, and that's when he realized for the first time that Libby wasn't in the bed beside him. She was nowhere in that main room. And so he got up thinking maybe she left, looked outside of the window, but her car was still there. So he kept on looking around inside the motel room, which is not very big, by the way. And at this point, according to him, he noticed the top of his camouflage belt peeking up over the top of the closed bathroom door. He said at this point he went and opened the door, and the belt obviously released and Libby fell forward onto the floor. Now, he told police the same thing he noted to dispatch, that immediately he saw that she was pale and blue and the belt was still tight around her neck. So he said he tried to loosen it, checked for a pulse, and didn't find one, so he immediately called 911, and from there he said he went to his dad's house. Now, he explained to them that he had already had several run-ins with the law in his past, and he claimed that he had been using drugs actively during all of this time period, so he was scared of getting in trouble for that. And so that's why he ultimately, in a panic, left the scene before authorities had even arrived. He also ended up telling the police after this that before he fell asleep, he and Libby had actually been in an argument, and he claimed this was over his meth use. From there, he immediately jumped into saying that Libby had actually threatened to end her life just the day before. And so he was really making it sound like this wasn't completely out of nowhere, that she was unhappy, not just with herself, but also with him and his meth use. She had already been threatening self-harm, and he even took it a step further, saying that she had actually done something like this before. He claimed that she had, quote, choked herself in the past, specifically with a belt, trying to make it seem like this was some sort of pattern, and this time she, I guess, had just taken it all the way. But in the same breath, he then goes on to suggest that the logistics weren't making a lot of sense to him. He started to tell authorities that he believed the door was too short for how long his belt was, and that he had no idea how Libby could have possibly hanged herself from the bathroom door. The door wasn't that tall. I mean, she was of average height. There was nothing for her really to jump off of or prop herself up on. And so instead, he offers up what he believed happened and goes on to basically say that he believed Libby did what she had done before, where she would use this belt to basically choke herself until she passed out. And then I guess he was suggesting that she somehow died after that. And so even in this first interview, there are signs that police were questioning the story he was giving. Detective Kevin Young, who was in the room with him at this point, straight up told Devin that he had investigated a lot of deaths and had never seen anyone able to choke themselves out as a way to end their own lives. And Devin's response was, quote, "That's what I'm saying," even though that was actually what he just suggested happened. And so this idea that Libby had been in emotional turmoil, that she had threatened to end her life, that this had been going on for some time, she had a history of using belts to, quote, choke herself, seemed to be the narrative that was being pushed almost immediately. And Devin wasn't the only person giving police a version that helped support it. Now, Nick, the friend who had been at the motel with them that morning, also gave authorities a statement. And in some ways, it helped support what Devin was saying, but in other ways, it actually introduced pretty important details that Devin conveniently left out. Now, according to Nick, he had been at the motel with Libby and Devin earlier that morning, a piece of information we already knew, and he told police that Libby, while he was there, seemed upset, that the two of them had been arguing. He even said that she had made comments that helped reinforce the idea that she was considering harming herself. I guess he heard her make these statements that morning. But Nick also described a sequence of events after Libby was found that did not match what Devin had told police. According to Nick, at some point after Devin says he found Libby, Devin actually called him and told him what happened to her at the motel. And Nick was apparently still close by, so he had his brother drop him off at the motel, and when he arrived, he met up with Devin. And from there, instead of staying at the scene and waiting for police, Nick said the two of them got into Libby's car and left together, heading toward Devin's dad's house. Devin never mentioned that he called Nick, that Nick showed up to the motel, that the two of them went to his dad's together. I mean, just completely left all of that out. And the timing of the call brings up a lot of questions as well, because unless Nick managed to get to this motel in like 2 seconds flat, it sounds like Devin may have actually called Nick before he even made the 911 call, or at the very least, it was like immediately afterward, and they all moved very, very quickly. But even then, there were still other pieces that weren't fitting neatly inside of this version that was building up so far. There was another witness at the motel who gave police a very different kind of detail. Now, this man said that he had seen Libby and Devin check in earlier that morning. And so this was another person that had seen Libby. And so far, the other two people have said that she was not okay, she was upset, she was threatening to end her life. But this guy said that nothing at all seemed obviously wrong. It was actually the exact opposite. He said that he heard them talking outside, and so he came outside not to like tell them to be quiet or anything, but this is like the kind of motel where lots of people come. There's a lot of drug use, drinking, partying. People are up all hours of the night. And so he's like, all right, new people to talk to. So he went outside and started to talk to them. And he said that everyone seemed completely fine. They were happy, having a good time. And Devin and Libby apparently said something along the lines of, they were young parents and were having some time away, like a little staycation kind of deal. And so this man didn't notice anything wrong at all in their brief conversation that they had. But later that day, just before the 911 call, he saw Devin again in the parking lot. This time, Devin was alone, upset, and he was like in the car about to leave the motel parking lot. Now, the witness said that he stopped him, to make sure he was okay. And right away, Devin told this man that he had found his wife dead in the room. Now, I want to state really quickly in all of the different interviews, witness statements, everything in this case, Devin goes from girlfriend to fiance to wife. I think they were technically engaged at one point. I don't really know what their status was, but it's all over the place. So if you hear me say different things, I'm not just saying it. That's just what he seemed to tell this one person. Anyways, so the witness then told him, all right, okay, if you found your wife dead in the bathroom, you need to call the police, and straight up told Devin that it was going to look really bad if he just drove off and left. And so eventually, after a little bit of back and forth, Devin decided to make the 911 call. But according to this witness, Devin drove away while he was still on the phone with dispatch and was obviously gone before the first responders got there. Now, if this account is accurate, that's a huge problem for what Devin said, because first of all, he claimed that he went, found Libby, and while he was still there in that moment, he immediately called 911. But in this version of events, he must have found her and then tried to just completely leave the scene. And when he was on the phone with dispatch, he wasn't even in the room. Not only that, but it seems he had zero intentions of calling 911 until he was urged by someone else to do so. There was also another man in the neighboring room who ended up coming forward and telling police that at some point that day, he heard what sounded like a pretty extreme argument coming from the room Libby and Devin were in. He said he heard a woman say something along the lines of, quote, "Please don't hurt me," but police didn't end up treating him as a strong witness. I guess he was incredibly intoxicated when they spoke to him. There were also some inconsistencies in his statement that weren't lining up with the timeline they had so far. So at that point, police already had conflicting stories, conflicting timelines, and people around the motel giving statements that were questionable. And that didn't stop the next day. Within about 24 hours of Libby being found, another huge witness came forward with information that should have, okay, keywords should have, added even more concern, because this time it was coming from someone who was loosely a part of Devin's family. I think this was the father of his half-brother, so someone who had been in a relationship with his mom at some point. I don't think they were together anymore, but this was someone that Devin clearly, communicated with, because he told police that Libby and Devin had been staying at his house in Kansas City, Kansas, just a week or so before this happened. And he claimed that on December 4th, which was exactly a week before Libby died, a commotion woke him up. Now, according to him, he heard all this noise, and so he walked over to the room that Libby and Devin were staying in, and he said normally he's the kind of person that would knock, but what he was hearing happening on the other side, he knew something was very, very wrong. And so right away, he just burst into the room. And when he did, he saw Devin on top of Libby with his hands around her neck. Okay? This man witnessed Devin trying to strangle Libby just a week before she dies of strangulation by a belt that is considered self-inflicted. So he said at this point, he kicked both of them out. He's like, I can't have this in my home. He gave them some money so they could at least get a motel. And he didn't see them again after that. And this wasn't just some random person. I mean, this was someone that was connected to the couple coming forward almost immediately saying, look, I witnessed some pretty serious violence against Libby just a week prior to her death. And he said the moment he heard the news about Libby's death and how it happened, he was immediately concerned that this could be something more. But like a lot of what was coming in during those first couple of days, it just was kind of one more piece in a pile of statements that didn't all seem to be treated with the same level of urgency. And from there, Libby was taken for an autopsy, and for her family, this is when things really started to feel off. But at this point, they were so trusting that authorities were going to handle everything, that there was an investigation going on behind the scenes. When something like this happens to someone, chances are they've never experienced anything like it before, so they don't know what to expect. When's the right time to push? What are the right questions to ask? Everyone just kind of goes with the flow and hopes that an investigation is unfolding the proper way. But that's not what seemed to be happening here. Libby was taken for an autopsy the following day, December 12th, and her family from there waited, not just for the cause of death, but for any kind of substantial or meaningful update from the investigating police. What did they learn from the scene? Who had they talked to? What had they made of the room, the body positioning, the belt, the fact that Devin fled the scene, the statements they were getting from other people at the motel? Because from the family's point of view, if this had been treated like a possible homicide in those first hours, then surely there would be some sort of follow-up here. There would be questions. Someone would sit down with them and explain what investigators had been doing, what made them change their mind. Were they fully convinced this was self-inflicted, or was there possibly a chance something else had happened? But instead, days went by, and then weeks went by, and then more weeks went by, and still Libby's family was getting nothing, and they were reaching out, and they were getting nothing in return. No one was responding to calls. They were just getting voicemail. There was nothing at all from authorities for 2 months, okay, until February. And that was when the cause of death was formally listed as asphyxia and the manner of death was ruled undetermined. And for Libby's family, they thought that should have changed everything. At the very least, it should have meant that the case stayed open and active while investigators kept on working through every single thing that wasn't adding up. But that is unfortunately not what happened. They didn't get the kind of call that they had been expecting from police after they received this letter in the mail. That was the way that they found out, to walk them through what had been found and where the investigation stood. Instead, they got this letter, had a million questions, and had to call the police themselves. And instead of finally getting the kind of answers they had been waiting for this whole entire time, Libby's family says they were told the case was going to be closed. The lead detective on the case said that he had tried to reach out to the medical examiner that did Libby's autopsy because there had been no explanation in any of his documents for why the manner of death was ruled undetermined. And obviously, the police department needs to know that to kind of push forward with other steps. Like, was there something specific you found that you weren't able to tell which way it went? Like, there's usually some sort of like general explanation, even if it's not super detailed, and so authorities can take that and keep going. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, the medical examiner would not get back to the police. And I'm over here like, do none of these people know how phones work? Like, can no one answer a phone call or an email or anything? And so from the police side, they said there was nothing more they could do. So the case was closing. But Cindy knew that she had a reason to be suspicious from the very beginning, without even knowing every single detail about what was found in that room, without knowing every single detail about the autopsy. But that feeling only intensified when she was able to see Libby and say her goodbyes. And I'm pretty sure that was likely before the autopsy was performed. She noted that there were fresh scratches, deep scratches at that, on Libby's forearms. Not only that, but she loved having her nails nice. So Libby typically had like pretty little acrylics going on. And her mom immediately noticed that several of them were broken. She also had very questionable bruising. She had injuries that were just not matching what had been told to her so far, but instead seemed to match known signs of a struggle. So she took pictures of everything herself because she didn't trust that those details were going to matter to anyone else the way that they mattered to her. Because at this point, it really doesn't seem like there was a very good investigation going. Now, she also decided to search her daughter's car after the forensic examination was done of that, considering after Libby's death, Devin and Nick had been using it, and this did nothing at all to help her feel more confident in the investigation because she ended up finding one of those missing broken acrylic nails tucked down between the seats. And that wasn't the only thing that bothered her. There was also damage to the car that hadn't been there literally just a week prior. And so it did nothing but add to the feeling that something was happening here, that something was wrong, that things were being missed. So for Cindy, it wasn't just that police had failed to explain Libby's injuries. It was that even after the forensic work was supposedly done, there were still pieces sitting right there in front of her that didn't seem to have been fully accounted for. But not only that, Cindy wasn't asking questions about Devin for no reason. And the worst part was that police knew that. Because in Devin and Libby's history, not only had this man that was tied to Devin's family come forward and said a week earlier he witnessed Devin strangle her, but there had been well over a dozen calls to law enforcement tied to domestic disturbances between Libby and Devin pretty much the entire relationship. That history existed long before Libby ever ended up in room 319, and it was already in front of police. So for Cindy and the rest of the family, it was impossible to understand how a case could end with undetermined with all of this information right there and just stop there. So now let's go back to years before when everyone says Libby's life began to shift, and the entire reason why Cindy was pushing so hard for authorities to properly do their job. Now, a lot of the complications and problems that I spoke about in the very beginning that started showing up in Libby's life seem to trace back to when Libby started dating Devin in high school. Now, I do want to be very careful here. There have never been any charges against Devin in relation to her death or any charges that actually came from the domestic violence calls, which is a whole other thing in itself. But at the same time, there is this very long history of alleged domestic violence claims between the two of them that is documented and several witnesses have attested to, and that has to be a part of the story too. Now, Libby met Devin when they were just freshmen in high school. I think a friend actually introduced them, and in the beginning, people really did see them as a cute young couple that was always together. She's this varsity cheerleader, he was a varsity football player. I mean, just your cliche high school romance, and everyone that described them said that they were both attached at the hip. It was like one of those couples that you roll your eyes at because they're always together, they're obsessed with each other, just like typical young love. And Libby's mom had always tried to encourage her to slow things down. Cindy, her mom, had actually gotten pregnant and married very, very, very young, and she wanted Libby to take her time. She didn't want her to follow the same footsteps. She wanted her to be able to experience life, not rush down the same path before she was ready, but the two of them just seemed incredibly infatuated with each other. And that's part of what makes cases like this so hard to look back on, because a lot of the time the beginning does not at all look like the end. And from the people who were closest to Libby, it sounds like it didn't take very long for things to start feeling different in their relationship. And a lot of that I think was so hard to get a handle on at first because so much of their relationship seemed to happen behind closed doors. Now, according to Libby's mom, Libby spent a lot of time with Devin tucked away in her room. They were off on their own enough that the adults around them didn't always know what was going on once the bedroom door shut. They were very private, they were very to themselves, and Libby just seems like she wasn't really the kind of person to share a lot about her personal life anyways. But what the family did start noticing were little things that were raising red flags that Libby and Devin never really had an explanation for. Libby's family would come home and find things broken. There would be pictures knocked off the walls, damage that really wasn't making a lot of sense. And then eventually there was a hole in Libby's wall that she couldn't explain. And while her family didn't know this until after her death, she actually ended up telling one of her friends that she and Devin had gotten into an argument and he shoved her head into the wall, and that is what created that hole. Now, on their own and not having that friend's account to consider, those things probably just seemed random. Kids were just playing, things happened and they didn't want to get into trouble. But altogether, and especially in hindsight, they started to feel a lot more concerning, and that concern only continued to grow. According to Libby's younger sister, like I said, they were very, very close and they spent all of their time together. And so when Libby got a boyfriend, that was no different. Her younger sister loved to tag along. She wanted to hang out with the older kids, with Libby and her new boyfriend. And so she spent a lot of time around the two of them. But immediately she started to notice some concerning things. Mainly the way that Devin would do things seemingly just to upset Libby and then act like she was the one being dramatic when she reacted. So just like gaslighting 101. Little things that felt meaner than they should have, more controlling than they should have, like more humiliating than they should have. And I feel like something that's really important to note here is that kind of dynamic can be really easy to dismiss when people are young. People will call it immaturity or drama or just be like, oh, they fought a lot. And especially when you start hearing actual examples of what would happen between Libby and Devin, it stops sounding harmless very quickly. Now, one of the moments that her sister specifically remembered was an incident with a lighter. According to her, Devin was flicking the lighter, he would flick it on, cut it off, and then while it was still hot, he would touch it to Libby, even when she was repeatedly asking him to stop. And at one point, according to Libby's sister, he ended up actually lighting her clothes on fire. And so she became hysterical, like ran upstairs, was freaking out, and somehow Libby was still made to feel like she was the one overreacting. And Libby's sister remembered just being like, that was incredibly messed up. And friends would later describe the exact same kind of shift, just in different ways. They said that they noticed Devin started to become very possessive of her, obsessive. He was allowed to go and do whatever he wanted, but Libby was not given that same kind of freedom. If she went somewhere, like if she went over to a friend's house for a sleepover, the entire time was spent receiving angry texts from Devin. If she tried to spend time away from him at all, there were always problems. So she stopped hanging out with her friends as much. She just stayed at home and then spent the rest of her time with Devin. And then when Libby was 16, she got pregnant. And that was a huge turning point in her life, obviously, not just because she was 16 years old and now going to have to navigate a life with a child, but also it was going to tie her future to his in a much deeper way. Now, there was a baby coming. Now, there was every reason in the world for Libby, someone known for being optimistic, for believing the best in people, for wanting the best for everyone, to want to believe for herself that things could still work, despite the fact that their relationship was not healthy at all. And from everything that her family later said, that is exactly how she approached it. She wanted more than anything for her family to stay together. And at times, it really did seem like that was what Devin wanted too. There were moments where he would step up, he would be there and tell her that the best thing in his life was Libby and their son. And that was all she wanted. That's literally all she wanted, but it was never consistent. According to her family, she did end up leaving Devin multiple times while she was pregnant, but they would always end up back together. Sometimes because, she needed him at an appointment or she needed help, or sometimes because, like so many people in abusive relationships, walking away emotionally and walking away practically are not at all the same thing. And her friends have said that Devin also knew exactly what she wanted to hear. He would say all the right things, he would recharge her hope, and she would latch right back on. And then, right around the time of her baby shower, Devin just vanished. He stopped showing up for Libby, he stopped showing up to appointments for their unborn son, and even when the time came for her to give birth, he wasn't there for that either. And that would become another pattern in their relationship where Devin would just disappear without saying a word. He would go do whatever he wanted to do, leave Libby, leave their son. She would be heartbroken and left to carry everything on her own. And then when he was ready to come back, she would let him back in with open arms. Again, not holding a grudge, wanting to give all the chances in the world, hoping that they could be together. She always wanted to hope that this time would be different. But instead, with Devin, it just continued to get worse. At this point, her sister later described hearing the couple arguing, which unfortunately was not anything abnormal. But this particular time, she walked past Libby's room and usually the door was shut, so she never knew what was happening on the other side. But this time, it was cracked just enough for her to be able to see Devin punch Libby in the thigh. This seems to be the first time that anyone in her family witnessed physical violence themselves. They knew the couple argued, they knew there were issues like that, but they'd never seen Devin hit Libby. And so obviously her sister immediately went and told their mom, and when they both confronted Libby about it, she ended up denying it. But the bruise left on her leg told her family the truth. So for a while, her family was still trying to make sense of things that were happening. There were moments that felt off, but they didn't necessarily have the full picture yet. They had a bruise, something broken in the house, a story that didn't quite make sense, just these little things that at the time were still being taken in piece by piece. And it's really important for me to say that because a lot of what feels obvious in hindsight was not obvious to them all at once while they were living it. A lot of this fuller picture only came together later, after Libby died, when friends and family started comparing what they knew, what they each had seen. Majority of what I'm telling you is information that Libby kept to herself, that she struggled through all on her own. But according to the family, there was one moment that ended up changing everything for Cindy. She witnessed some of this physical abuse herself. Now, according to Cindy, she walked out into the living room one day and saw Devin on top of Libby, smothering her with his body. Cindy immediately called 911, grabbed a bat, and tried to get him off of her daughter. And that seems to have been the moment where she stopped trying to explain any of this away and finally was connecting all of the dots, saying, you know what? This is not all right. Like, this is not healthy. This is not acceptable. And so she put her foot down. And after that, police started getting called on a more regular basis. police. And those calls weren't just coming from Libby's family. As time went on and Libby moved out occasionally, other people started calling too. Neighbors, friends, landlords, and other people who were around the two of them and were seeing or hearing that something was so clearly wrong. Now, at this point, Devin was no longer supposed to be at the house, but according to Libby's family, that didn't stop him from coming around. He would yell from outside. He would throw eggs at the house. He would drive up and down the street with his friends, screaming and blasting music. He would stand outside in the middle of the night, like just creeping in the edge of the woods, yelling threats and things at the house. Her family's even described a moment where they looked outside and he was outside shirtless, swinging a hammer as some sort of threat. And every single time he would show up, Cindy would call the police to try to get them to come and do something. Like, he clearly was going to continue coming back. He wasn't going to listen to her. Libby was also in this horrible space where, they had a huge history together. They had a child together. She felt very conflicted. Again, something very normal and unfortunate about violent relationships. And at this point, these were not random calls being made to the police over ordinary high school relationship problems. I mean, she was calling because they were scared. But one of the most maddening things about this part of the story is that even though police were being called, nothing ever really happened. Now, according to Libby's family, basically, Devin would show up, start this chaos, they would call, and he would leave before officers got there. And according to what Cindy has said, he saw this pattern himself, and it almost became a joke. He would be like, I'm too fast for them, they're not going to get me. And so when authorities got there, they would just have Cindy's word, and Libby was often viewed as uncooperative because she would not confirm anything to police that was happening. And again, that is common. A lot of victims minimize what is happening. They deny it. They protect the person hurting them or stay quiet altogether. And sometimes it's because they're scared of what will happen if they tell the truth. Sometimes it's because they still love the person. They still hope that things will get better, or if they've been manipulated into thinking that it's somehow their fault. And a lot of the time, it is every single one of those things at once. So because of that, it seems like these calls were brushed off instead of being treated like part of a much bigger problem and much bigger pattern. And then things got even worse because at some point, instead of the repeated calls being treated as evidence that this family was dealing with an ongoing and escalating domestic disturbance problem, Cindy said the house itself was labeled a nuisance property. That is legitimately one of the most infuriating parts of this entire case. Like, the moment I read that when I was researching, I audibly screamed out of pure rage because this is a mother repeatedly calling the police because she is scared, because her daughter is in a violent, unstable relationship, because this young man keeps showing up and causing scenes and frightening the household. And they are labeled the nuisance because he manages to get away in just enough time. Like, in what world is the police department supposed to act like that? Like, be like, oh, well, you know what? She's the problem. You're the problem. And stop calling us for help. Okay? Yeah, because that makes perfect sense. Okay? Now, somewhere in the middle of all of that, drug use, addiction, specifically meth, became part of the picture too. And this is a part of Libby's story that is so hard to talk about because once addiction becomes part of a case, it can completely change the way people look at the person in the center of it, okay? We see this happen all the time. I cover so many cases where drug use is a part of it, where addiction is a part of it, and I see time and time again people hear drugs and immediately start to distance themselves. They minimize what that person went through or use it to explain away the worst things that happened to them. Like, somehow it makes it less serious or less worth digging into. Like, they're not as deserving of help or protection or real answers. And I don't want that to happen to Libby. Unless you have walked beside someone who has struggled through addiction, you will truly never understand the kind of hellscape it is. The fine line you're always dancing on, the way that you want to help them, and you realize like it's a problem they can no longer control. I mean, it is such a nightmare. These people need more help than the average person. So the fact that instead the opposite is seen, that they deserve nothing, it's just absolutely baffling to me. Anyways, so according to friends, Libby said that she had been pressured to try meth because it was something Devin had already been doing for some time. Like, when she was introduced to Devin, like, her friend said she didn't even like think about alcohol. She probably didn't even know what it was or like what was happening with it, or like the idea of like getting high or any of that was foreign to her. She was just so into all of her sports. But Devin had used meth for some time. Unfortunately, it was something that was a regular in his household as he was a child. And so while they were around all of his friends, he really pushed and pushed and pushed, and she ended up giving in. And it doesn't take much before someone is trapped in something that starts making every part of their life harder. From there, it seems like it led to even more problems with Devin, more instability, more situations where Libby was vulnerable and in over her head. People that knew Devin and people that knew Libby said that when Devin in particular was using, he would become incredibly violent. At this point, it was just a really bad situation for everyone. There were stretches where the two of them worked hard for a while. They would get sober for a bit. They had jobs, they saved up, they bought a car, and then the cycle would start all over again. And all of this while they were caring for a toddler. And at one point, according to the people around Libby, one of the times where they both worked really hard to get that car and get a place to stay and get a bank account, Devin ended up draining the bank account, took their car, and ran off with another girl that he worked with. And Libby's mom has even posted a picture of the moment when Libby found this out. It seemed like every time she would get close to success, every time she would almost be there, he would drag them both down into the pits of hell again. And that kind of back and forth seems to have defined so much of Libby's short adult life. Now, the longest stretch that they were separated came in the summer of 2017 when Devin ended up going to jail on unrelated charges. And during that time, the people around Libby said that she was doing so well. Every time they would separate, every time they would spend time apart, even if it was only for a week, Libby would just immediately be like a new person. And so having this long stint, people really got to see the Libby they remembered. She was clean, she was working, she was rebuilding, she was able to get her own apartment, she was able to get her own car. I mean, in that short span of time, a couple of months, she completely turned her life around. Like, this was the Libby they knew when she wasn't with Devin. And so the people who loved her were hopeful. It looked like she might finally be getting some real footing under her again. But when he was released, as he always did, he found her. He kept showing up at her apartment, and for a while, she really did seem to try to ignore him. And then he started posting on Facebook. And this is where you can so clearly see the manipulation. And I'm devastated for her. His first post, you can see the manipulation because he's like, she needs to grow up, like, be the adult. Let me see my son. She's keeping me away from him, like using their son as leverage, publicly shaming her, making her seem like she's the petty one. And when that didn't invoke the response he wanted, those posts just started to get nastier and nastier and nastier. And I guess eventually he made himself impossible to ignore because eventually her family started noticing the same signs all over again after a stretch of such success and good things for Libby. They were back together. She lost her job, she lost her apartment, and it felt like they were right back at square one. And so eventually, by September of 2017, just a few months prior to her death, the situation got serious enough that Cindy felt she had no choice but to call CPS because she was worried about her grandson. Libby and Devin were homeless, and I mean, it seems they always at least had like a hotel they could stay in, or they would stay at a friend's house, or a relative's house, but it was not the consistent safe space that this little 3-4-year-old boy needed to be raised in. And so this is a really heartbreaking part of the story because it wasn't about anyone questioning Libby not loving her child or not wanting to be his mom. Everyone knew how much she loved him and that even when the worst was going on, she cared for him the best that she could. This was about protection. It was about her family trying to make an incredibly hard decision, hoping that it would keep her son safe, but also hoping it might be a wake-up call for Libby. And that's such a difficult position for families to be in when addiction is involved because it becomes this constant double-edged sword where you're trying to protect the people involved, you're trying to set boundaries, you're trying to do what feels necessary, but at the same time, you're terrified that those decisions might push your loved one further away or deeper into the very thing that you're trying to help them out of. And that's exactly where Libby's family was. So Libby's son was placed into Cindy's custody. And from everything that has been shared about that period, losing custody did not make Libby shut down or give up. If anything, it seems to have lit a fire under her, which is exactly what her entire family hoped would happen. Now, by November of 2017, so just a few months after this, Libby was working hard toward reunification with her son. She had been given strict orders by the judge. She would have to take random drug tests, she would have to take classes, there would be several court appearances, and by all accounts, she was consistently doing everything she was supposed to do. She was testing clean, earning more time with her son. She was working towards supervised visits by November. She was also making plans to get her own apartment again. They had helped her apply for housing, they helped her apply for schooling for her son, and according to the parent aide that met with her most, one of the first things they noticed during the visitations with her son that she got weekly was just how much Libby loved him and just how much he loved her right back. Libby was always down on the floor with him, playing games, laughing, cleaning him up, making him food, being silly with him. It was like everything else just melted away when she was with him. Her parent aide has said that she could tell Libby was vulnerable. She was in a really bad situation and she just didn't have the tools or support she needed to fully get out of it. Like, they fully believed she was capable of being the best mom, of moving on, but she was just being dragged back time and time again in this horrific cycle, and that made them want to get her out of it even more. Libby was struggling, but she was also trying, and both of those things can be true at the same time. Now, for roughly those 3 months, like I said, everything Libby was doing was being watched closely, and the people that were working with her to make sure she was a fit mom, I mean, all of these things that she was having to do, all these hoops she was having to jump through, they didn't see someone who had stopped trying. Like, they saw someone who finally was like, all right, I have the support I need to get out of this. Like, I'm going to rebuild. I am done with this. And not a single one of them saw any sign that she was a self-harm risk, which I think is very, very, very important to note. But by the beginning of December 2017, things started escalating again. And the biggest turning point in that final week came on December 4th, which is a date that might immediately stand out to you guys based on something I told you about. Now, that day, Libby showed up to the visitation she had with her son, and the parent aide immediately noticed that something was wrong. Like, they had been doing this weekly at this point. She knew Libby pretty well. Like, she knew how bubbly Libby was, how happy she was, especially when she was able to come and see her little boy. But this time, Libby looked really shaken up. She looked like she had been crying. She looked scared. And according to the parent aide, when she asked Libby what was going on, Libby told her that Devin had strangled her that day. And so this lines up perfectly with what had already reported to police the day after she was found dead. So corroborating the story of what he saw. This was also the first time Libby was admitting to an authority figure just how bad things had gotten. She had only admitted to maybe a friend or two at this point that things were bad, that he was harming her. And so after that, the people around her understood that things had crossed into something even more serious. And abuse of any kind is bad, but this is now strangulation, okay? And statistically, in domestic violence situations where a partner tries to strangle the other, it is much more likely that is going to end in murder, statistically. And so that was a huge red flag.
He said that Zave's dad had just gotten out of jail and that he choked her, and, you know, she was afraid. She was afraid of him.
I think that's where she was that last few weeks, is just kind of complying to keep peace. She was trying to, I think, figure out a way to get out of it, and it just became too late.
There were efforts at this point that same day, like they dropped everything and made efforts to find her somewhere safe. The parent aide tried to help find a domestic violence shelter for her. They had already been speaking about doing something like this, about putting her in some sort of outpatient, like rehab facility, somewhere where she could heal from the drug use still, because meth is not fun to come off of, and to just continue to build her life, keep that support there for her. But now it was like pedal to the metal. And so these calls were made to try to figure out where she could go, and they did end up finding somewhere. But by the time the meeting with her son was done, Libby decided not to go. And from what has been shared, the house that they found for Libby to go to required that she first go to the police, and then officers would escort her to the house. I personally think, again, this is just me personally, because I can't read her mind. She can't tell anyone at this point. But I personally feel like after the way police treated her, and her family over all those domestic violence calls, the fact that not a single one of them believed anything was going on, the fact that they were labeled a nuisance home, I think Libby didn't trust them. I think that, paired with probably her fear of what Devin was going to do if she went to the police about him, she declined. And that fear was definitely real because Libby also spoke to her sister that same day. Her sister begged her to stay, not to go back, saying, stay here, we'll take care of you. But Libby very specifically told her that if she stayed, she was putting everyone else around her in danger, that she was staying away and staying with Devin so that he wouldn't go on to harm anyone else. It seems like this entire week, Libby continued finally telling other people that she didn't feel safe with Devin. The day before Libby died, she was with one of her close friends and Devin. They were driving around, and apparently in a moment where they stopped at a gas station and Devin went inside to pay for gas, she immediately looked at this friend, and he said that her face went from like being happy, she was fine. Devin walked out and she looked at him and he immediately knew something was wrong. In that brief window where Devin was inside, Libby proceeded to tell this friend that she didn't feel safe, that something about Devin had shifted and she was scared. Things were not okay. And she was trying to figure out a way to get out in whatever moments she could get. And this friend offered her a place to stay, was like, you can come and stay with me. But she was like, no, like, I'll figure this out on my own. Again, probably because of the reason that she told her sister literally a week before, that she was scared wherever else she went was going to put everyone else around her in danger, and she didn't want to put that on anyone. And she also even asked for help the day that she died. On December 11th, Libby ended up contacting a friend asking him to come pick her up. And from what I can tell, she was already at the motel at this point. She walked away from Devin and she told this friend on the phone, she's like, I got to get out of here. Like, you got to come pick me up. I can't stay. There's something wrong. Like, Devin's not all right. But that call didn't end up lasting long. The friend was fully planning on coming and getting her. He was like, all right, just tell me where, just tell me when. Like, I'll be there in a heartbeat. But before they could ever make a real plan, she very abruptly ended the phone call saying that Devin had walked up. And this was the exact same day that she would be found dead. So with all of this history, and by the time you get to December 11th, you can see that this isn't a situation where everything had been fine and normal, and then suddenly something happened out of nowhere. That is the context of the years and years of their relationship. That's the context of the final week. That final week was the point where Libby, for the first time in years, was telling people something was wrong, that she was scared of Devin, that she felt something bad was going to happen, and she needed help to get out right away. And without that context, what happened in room 319 loses a massive part of the picture. Now, by the time investigators were looking at this case, there was already a significant amount of information available to them. They knew about all of these calls about Devin and Libby. They saw that things at the scene weren't fully matching what was described on the 911 call, from the position of Libby's body to the condition of the room. They had only been in that room since early that morning, and it was a complete disaster. And not only that, but they had everything from that week leading up to her death, and it wasn't just friends that Libby had confided in, it was a parent aide, literally someone working with the government that had personally heard from Libby that she had been strangled. And then a witness from Devin's own family saying that he saw Devin choke her just days earlier. Multiple people saying Libby told them she didn't feel safe. And the fact that the day she died, she was actively trying to get help and actively finally leave, taken together, that should have been enough to slow things down and take a closer look at what actually happened. But instead, the investigation appears to have very quickly centered around Devin's versions of events, without ever fully working to confirm or challenge it. There were several basic steps that, based on what the family later learned, either were not completed or were not fully documented. For example, there was surveillance at the motel, and apparently one of the officers did try to go and get it, but whoever was working there didn't have access at the time, and so they were instructed by the lead to go back and get that footage to corroborate Devin's story. But no one ever went back and got it. So that means there was no way, at least visually, to confirm anything, showing if Devin left the room, how long he may have gone, when Nick arrived. Nothing at all to corroborate Devin's claims of what happened that day when it was available. And not only that, there were several other businesses. This is a pretty main street, and not a single one of them were ever looked into to see if there were any other movements by Libby's car throughout that day. On top of that, there's no indication investigators ever extracted the data from Libby's phone, Devin's phone, or Nick's phone. I have seen somewhere that they did take the phones, but claimed they didn't know which was which, so they just never looked into it, which is the dumbest excuse I've ever heard in my life. So between the missing surveillance, the lack of phone data, some of the most basic ways to lock down a timeline were never used. Devin also told police that he had left the scene and went to his dad's house. Nick confirmed the same thing, but according to the family, that claim was never independently verified. Devin's dad and stepmom have come forward and said the investigators never sat down with him, never confirmed when Devin arrived, what he said, what condition he was in. And that stands out even more because Libby's family was able to get all of the case files in the case, which I again will get into in a little bit. And there was audio from that night when Devin finally spoke to police. There was the recorded interview. And before Devin was ever spoken to, he was left alone in the interview room with his phone, which usually is like an investigative tactic where they want to see who the person will call, what they will do, like what they might hear, thinking no one's listening to them. I think in this case, it might have just been authorities didn't think about it. But regardless, he immediately called his dad. They have a recorded call where he's speaking to his dad and stepmom. They're even on speakerphone. Like you can hear the whole conversation. And in that call, he appears to be telling them what to say, that they needed to remember that he was at their house, saying, make sure to tell them I was there. And at one point, it even sounds like his dad literally says he's not going to lie for him. But lie about what? Like, did Devin not ever go over there? Who knows, because authorities never went and questioned his dad and stepmom. And then also in that recorded phone call, his dad specifically says that he's worried about Nick and what Nick might say and how one wrong word and Devin would be in trouble. During that, you would assume that would immediately warrant a follow-up, that would immediately push authorities to go and speak to his dad and stepmom. Like, why were you guys talking about what stories you were going to tell? Why did you say you weren't going to lie for him? Why were you worried that Nick would say one thing and get everyone in trouble? But unfortunately, it just doesn't really look like that was done. It seems that the investigation narrowed almost right away toward a single explanation. And once that happened, other details may not have been pursued with the same level of urgency. And that became even more apparent later when Cindy began trying to understand what had actually been done in the investigation. I mean, when you look at all of the things that Cindy brought up when it came to seeing her daughter, I mean, there were the broken nails, there was the nail left behind in the car that was never obviously collected for forensic testing. Like, was there ever a check to see if there was DNA under her fingernails, to see if maybe there had been a fight since she had all these gashes in her arms? Like, not only that, Libby was dirty. Her feet were apparently dirty. Her hands were dirty. It was clear she hadn't taken a shower, despite the fact Devin claims that's exactly what she was doing when he went to go to sleep. I mean, there was just right away all of these questionable things that just didn't seem to be handled like they mattered at all. And this became even more apparent later on when Cindy did try to start understanding what had been done in the investigation, because unfortunately, it seems this is not an irregular thing for this department. And she connected with another mom who experienced very similar things. And this mom pushed her and was like, go file a FOIA, like get those records, because if they're going to close the case, the least they can do is give you the records so you can understand what's going on. And all she found was gap after gap, areas that had not fully been followed up on, timelines that had not been clearly established, and questions that had never really been answered. And the police department actually ended up being asked at some point, what happened in those few hours when all of your officers immediately had the gut feeling that this was homicide, that it was being staged to look like something different. What happened to change your mind? And the lead actually said that the ME that was there looked at Libby's body and immediately said, like, you guys are blowing this out of the water. Like, this is very clearly self-inflicted. It is not a homicide. And that right there was the turning point. That is what made them decide to not look into it as a homicide anymore. But upon further digging into all of these files, it wasn't even an ME on scene. It wasn't a doctor at all. This was like a brand new, fresh out of school ME investigator. So like they just go to collect information to give back to the ME. And nowhere in her notes did she ever say that she said this was not a homicide. She actually came forward and said that it was not my position to say. I was just there to gather information. I don't remember ever saying that to anyone. So after the case was closed, Libby's family got all of these files themselves and brought them to a private investigator to review everything independently. And the investigator was actually the first person who was able to get them a sit-down meeting with the police department, which was something that the family had been trying to get on their own for months, and it had been unsuccessful. And And he also started going through all of the different reports, and he saw the exact same thing the family had been feeling. There were major investigative gaps in this case. So from there, the case ended up being reviewed by outside experts, and the one that made a huge impact was Dr. Bill Smock. So Dr. Smock, and this is so important, like if there is anything at all in this video that you listen to and take in, this is it. This to me should have blown everything wide open. This should have done more than it did. Now, Dr. Smock is the medical director for Alliance for Hope's Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, okay? Very important. He also was the police surgeon for Louisville Metro Police, okay? Basically, in a nutshell, he is nationally known for being a forensic physician with specific expertise in strangulation cases. And he reviewed Libby's case file, including the autopsy, the scene photographs, and he did not come away from this thinking that it looked like a straightforward self-inflicted hanging. Instead, he actually went as far as saying to him there was clear evidence showing that Libby had been murdered and the scene was staged. So that same gut feeling that had been there from the beginning that officers felt and then ultimately for whatever reason was ignored, he was saying, yeah, that is absolutely what this looks like. So Dr. Smock focused first on the ligature mark on Libby's neck. According to him, the mark seen at the autopsy, what was photographed, showed a ligature mark going completely around her neck with no disconnection. And based on his experience, that is not what you typically see in a hanging. And I feel like, honestly, that is also just kind of common sense. So in cases of self-inflicted hanging or just hanging in general, the mark is usually angled. It is more like an upside down V because there is the point of suspension that is going to ultimately end up being at the back of the neck based on physics. And so there's not pressure there. And so usually you see a ligature mark that does not complete a full circle. So why was the ligature found around Libby's neck going all the way around, a complete circle? He also said that the belt left more specific marks on Libby's neck that didn't match the way a hanging should look either. Dr. Smock said that the buckle mark appeared to have been pressing into the front of her neck. And again, when you think about suspension point and physics, in a hanging, the buckle would shift up and around toward the back of the neck, again, where that suspension point is. And so typically you wouldn't see a buckle mark at all. So why on earth was there a very clear impression of a buckle mark on the very front of her neck? Then he noted the bruising found on Libby's body. Dr. Smock pointed to injuries on her neck, her chest, and her back. There was a pattern of bruising across her chest that, in his opinion, suggested that there had been some kind of added pressure applied there. Maybe she had been restrained or something at some point. But then he specifically pointed to a mark in the middle of her back, or a pattern of marks that he believed looked like it could have been made by a boot or a shoe, as if someone was stepping on her back. So in other words, he was looking at Libby's body and seeing signs that to him looked more like she had been harmed by someone else than she had done this to herself. And probably one of the biggest things that supports that, not like all of this doesn't so far support it, is he also looked at the way Libby was found in the bathroom. She was on the floor, not suspended, which obviously if Devin opened the door and she fell down, that's to be expected, but it would have taken quite a bit for her to have fallen over to the right side of the toilet. Like the way her body was positioned, she didn't naturally fall that direction, especially with her feet up. Now, could she have been held and moved there? It's definitely a possibility. However, the logistics of the room really don't support that it would have been physically possible for Libby to strangle herself. Like the height of the room, the height of the door, if she had jumped off of the tub, like that wouldn't have been possible because of the distance to the door and how long the belt was. I believe that the entire physical setup of the room itself worked against that explanation. But most importantly, and it's the biggest piece to me, is the way the belt was found around Libby's neck. So I already said the ligature mark went all the way around her neck, which does not line up, but the injury pattern showed that pressure had been applied by a flat belt that went all the way around her neck. But in the photos, when they found Libby, the belt had a twist in it, which in his view means that the belt had been placed around her neck, the pressure had been applied, the belt was taken off, and then quickly put back on a different way. Why on earth would someone do that, okay? And then there was the mark on the top of the bathroom door. There was evidence of green fibers and of damage to the very top of the door. The belt was only about 2 inches thick, not much movement at all during this alleged hanging. And there was also no damage at all to the bathroom, which wasn't adding up because your body fights strangulation. Your brain wants to survive. So you would typically see damage, and it just wasn't there. So his conclusion was that someone killed Libby and then staged it to look self-inflicted. Now, Dr. Smock presented his findings on Libby's case at the Alliance for Hope conferences attended by law enforcement and prosecutors, judges, advocates, self-defense attorneys, medical experts, literally everyone. He also presented the case at the annual Medical Legal Death and Homicide Investigation Conference in August of 2020 as an example of how to recognize a staged scene, and the consensus at all of those reviews was consistently homicide. And so those findings were brought to the local police department, Independence Police Department, saying, look, none of this is adding up. He had a whole entire PowerPoint presentation, but the department would not change their conclusion. They essentially stuck by what they said, saying they had investigated all they could. The original ME said it was undetermined. No one could get the ME to talk to anyone. After he made this ruling, he literally apparently just vanished and never said anything to anyone about the case, even when the investigating agency continued to ask him. Even when new MEs tried to go and ask him, there was no explanation given whatsoever, and no one wanted to change his original filing. So everyone basically was like, well, it's out of our hands, and that's that. That is one of the most frustrating things I have ever heard. I feel like the evidence that Dr. Smock presented makes so much sense on a common sense level. It's not even information that I feel like needs to be said in layman's terms for it to just connect every single dot, yet it was just not at all taken into consideration. Now, there were later reviews of Libby's case, but even those came with their own limitations, and in a lot of ways, the exact same frustrations her family have been dealing with from the very beginning. At one point, the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office did review the case, which is what I was just talking about with Dr. Smock, to determine whether there was enough evidence to move forward with the charges, and ultimately they declined to file, saying there was not enough evidence to prove a homicide beyond a reasonable doubt. And I want to point out that that's not the same thing as saying nothing happened. It just means they didn't believe they could meet that legal threshold required to prosecute. But it was so frustrating because even, I think she was like a forensic specialist. There was some sort of forensic specialist that was there when this meeting was held. And even she came forward afterwards saying that it felt like they just didn't want to step on the original ME's toes. Like they all just didn't want to change what this original ME said. And it's likely because, as I've already told you, there were several issues within the department. The department itself had some problems, but also the ME's office in particular. According to investigations that were done connected to that original ME, there were several instances where they were not properly performing autopsies on cases that were coming in as suspected self-inflicted deaths. They were just immediately deeming it a self-inflicted death and moving forward. They were not looking for signs something else potentially happened. And so I think there was one specific case where it was determined to be self-inflicted, and they actually ended up finding for a fact it was homicide. At this point, they probably were so scared to label it one way or another that when there was even like an inkling of doubt, they just said undetermined and then got scared to ever touch it again. And now around that same time, the case was briefly reopened in 2019. I think they actually reopened it and then reclosed it a handful of times, according to what the lead detective said. But when they reopened it in 2019, it was actually after the PI had brought forward all this information, and Devin was in fact interviewed a second time. Keyword, second time. So in all of this, he was only interviewed that one first time when he came to authorities. But even then, the kinds of questions that could have clarified major gaps in the timeline or to answer any questions at all just weren't pushed. In this interview, he denied ever putting his hands on Libby, said he'd never put his hands on a woman, said he would never have done anything to harm her, and they never pushed it at all. They didn't even bring up all the domestic disturbance phone calls tied to them. I mean, literally nothing. They just took his word and moved forward. Like, didn't even try to give him a hard time to see what he would spout out. And I normally would not be a big advocate for that. I think that sometimes the way that authorities interrogate or question is a little bit harsh. But given all of the history they had at this point, given all the phone calls they knew of, given the witnesses that had come forward, they had every single reason and right to bring these things up to him and ask. But that is essentially where it stopped. There was no clear shift in direction. This reopening lasted for like 2 seconds before it was closed. There were no major new investigative steps documented, no indication that the inconsistencies that were raised had been resolved. It was just really, really frustrating. There was also later involvement from the FBI, but even that came with limits. In 2022, Independence Police did reach out to the FBI, and FBI agents ended up going to room 319 to take measurements and photographs. And an outside medical examiner also reviewed the scene photos, the autopsy report. But one of the family's biggest frustrations when it came to the FBI's involvement is that the review was of all of the original medical examiner information, the original investigation. So it didn't seem like it was a fresh, ground up reevaluation, and more just like a later review deferring to what had already been decided. And that still just did not amount to the kind of full independent reinvestigation that they were hoping for. Her own family said they were never interviewed by the FBI themselves. It doesn't appear that the FBI went back and did any new investigative work from the ground up other than taking these measurements. It just seemed like the review was largely based off of the material Independence Police already had. And so in early 2023, after the FBI assisted review, the case was closed again. So still, there was no formal change to Libby's manner of death. It remained undetermined. And then, even years later, new information continued to surface. Information that maybe if they'd gone around and asked questions, interviewed people, they would have had from the beginning. Now, this came from a man who was connected to Devon's dad. He came forward with a statement that raised serious questions about the timeline. And this popped up on my YouTube page a couple of months ago. And that's when I knew I needed to cover this case, because how many people were going to come out with information that connected dots, answered questions. It's just so crazy this information keeps coming out and still nothing seems to change.
What is telling the police is not, the time frame is not correct.
Information that calls into question the entire timeline of the day Libby died.
He knew she was dead that morning.
According to this man, on the morning of December 11th, hours before that 8 p.m. 911 call, he went to Devon's dad's house. He, I guess, was helping Devon's dad at the time. This man was helping to take Devon's younger brother to school every morning. And so by his estimate, it would have been somewhere around 8 or 8:30 that morning when he showed up to Devon's dad's house. And while he was there, Devon showed up to his dad's house. Now, mind you, Devon claimed to authorities in his own accounts of what happened that day that they were all hanging out at the motel. Nick was with him until 9 a.m. and then he showered and fell asleep till 8 p.m. So why is this person claiming Devon showed up to his dad's house at 8 or 8:30 that morning instead? And even more horrifically, according to this man, he overheard Devon tell his dad that Libby had hanged herself at the motel.
He said that Libby had hung herself and she's back at the hotel. What should he do? His dad told him, I'll tell you what, you go call the cops.
If this account is accurate, it directly contradicts the entire version of events that Devon gave police, where he claimed he had been asleep all day, he had never left the motel, he discovered Libby that evening, and then he called the police. This would mean that he knew she was dead hours earlier. Not that night, but that morning. And given the fact that authorities said when they found her, she was cold to the touch, she had been dead for some time, that would make a whole lot of sense. But even crazier, this man wasn't the only one confirming that timeline. Devon's own dad confirmed this timeline, okay?
It was around the time I was getting my kid up. I had to get my kid up for school to take him to school.
It was in the morning time.
I do know that is correct.
I can't help but wonder if authorities had gone to speak to Devon's dad, this is the same version of events he would have told them from the get-go, and maybe if that would have changed anything. Now, this man that came forward obviously came forward years after the fact, and he said that when he tried to bring up this information to the police, he felt like he just wasn't taken seriously. They were not interested in it, and that was that. So he actually went on and spoke to the news, he did interviews trying to get this new information out there, because this is absolutely crazy. This should be looked into right away. Again, maybe if they had spoken to his dad, maybe if they had spoken to his stepmom, maybe if they had obtained that surveillance footage from not just the motel, but anywhere else, they could have been able to confirm if this actually was the timeline. And instead, Devin, for whatever reason, waited hours and hours and hours to report Libby as dead. This is such a wildly frustrating case. Libby was 21 years old. She was a young mom, actively trying to get her son back, staying clean, meeting every court requirement, fighting to rebuild her life one day at a time. She was asking for help in that whole week leading up to her death. And then it seems like even in the investigation, she was again failed. Now, Devin's family has firmly stood beside him. They have said that they don't believe that he would ever harm Libby. They've acknowledged verbal violence, so they did know about that, but they maintain that they never saw or believed physical violence was happening at the level that has since been described. Now, I've spoken about this in other cases before, and it's something that I feel strongly about. When investigators are rushed and complete or not fully impartial, it hurts everyone involved. It leaves the victim without real justice, and it also leaves the person under suspicion in a kind of permanent limbo where serious questions obviously linger, but nothing has ever been proven in court. And that is such an awful place for a case to be. And unfortunately, when you have these incomplete investigations, a lot of the questions, the answers are now forever gone. Like they would have been there in the surveillance footage, all these things that I've said time and time again. And that's information that you just cannot get back. And that just sucks because Libby deserved so much more than that. Her family deserved so much more than that. They deserve the truth, whether that was the fact that she was exhausted from the fight and she made the heartbreaking choice to end her own life, or whether someone ruthlessly took it from her. They should have found the answer. Her death deserved a full, unbiased, intense investigation where every single lead was followed, no stone was left unturned. But instead, years later, her manner of death is still listed as undetermined. And that is not closure, and it should never have been treated like closure. Her little boy and the rest of her family are still carrying this weight of having no clue what actually happened to her. And in interviews that Libby's mom has come forward and spoken in, she talks about how Libby's little boy asks, what happened to my mom? He's asking all of these questions and she doesn't even know how to answer them because she doesn't know herself what actually happened. No one seems to know what actually happened. And it's not even like this is a case where the police are saying, oh yeah, absolutely self-inflicted. They're saying that's most likely, but even the ME is saying they can't really say for sure. It's just one giant question mark. And not only has this little boy lost his mother, but also his dad is at the very center of it. And from what I have seen, he's actually currently incarcerated and won't be getting out for a very long time on unrelated other charges. No family deserves to sit and not know for this long. It's absolutely crazy to me, and it's even more frustrating knowing there have been so many experts that have come forward and said all these things and made all these determinations and tried to convince the police, but it's just not been enough. And that is so unfair. It is so unfair for Libby. It is so unfair for her family. It is so unfair for her son. It's unfair for anyone who has been wrapped up in this investigation that should have answered questions and just didn't. With that being said, if you have any information at all that could help bring clarity to Libby's case, please reach out to the Independence Police Department. I know there is a Facebook group. Sharing the story also helps to keep her name and her voice out there, so eventually answers can be found. With changes in forensic science, with changes in technology and different experts that are out there, there could be someone that might be able to offer help that they've not been able to use so far. Now, with that being said, thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Libby's story. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallen fam so we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I do want to very quickly note that if you or someone that you know, someone that you love is experiencing domestic violence, there is help available. I'm going to leave the National Domestic Violence Hotline down below. You're not alone. There are people out there that are ready to support you, ready to get you in a safe environment. I know it can feel impossible, but there are people that dedicate their every breathing moment to making sure that you can be safely helped. And I say that from the bottom of my heart. You can get out. But until then, please remember to look out for one another. Every single life matters. Every victim deserves the truth, no matter what their history. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and go. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you in my next video.